Hi everybody, in this video I want to finish up with the fallacies of weak induction, meaning slippery slope fallacy, and the weak analogy fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy is another one that does sort of have a format to it. We can't say that it's entirely formal, but there is at least a paraphrase of it that fits a certain format, similar to appeal to ignorance. And with slippery slope, the nice thing about it is that it's a real distinctive pattern. So that makes it pretty easy to identify, at least in the sort of cooked up examples, the fictional examples that we give. It's an argument that goes like this. A leads to B, B leads to C, and then through some indeterminate number of steps we get to Z. Z is some kind of catastrophe or a logical absurdity. And so we conclude A has to be rejected. So again, it can either be a catastrophic event where we're saying these links on the chain are events that will happen, which will lead to this catastrophe, or it could be a logical absurdity, meaning that if we accept conclusion A, we get conclusion B, we get conclusion C, and then we get the final conclusion, which is an absurdity. And what makes it a fallacy is that there's no objectively good reason to predict this chain reaction. The only thing that's appealed to is a kind of similarity between the links on the chain. So I'll borrow an example from the textbook. I say, don't get your son Jimmy a slingshot for Christmas. Because you get him a slingshot for Christmas, you know what he's going to want for his birthday, right? BB gun. And then it's pretty much the same thing, so you got to get it for him. And then he's going to want to get a 22 gauge rifle for the next holiday. That's pretty similar to a BB gun, almost the same thing. So you got to get him that. Then he's going to want a 12 gauge, and then he's going to want, high-powered rifle, 30-06. And then the next thing he's going to want to get an assault rifle, AR-15. And then the next thing he's going to want to get a bazooka. And then he's going to get a missile launcher. He's going to get into building missiles. He'll build a nuclear missile. He'll launch the nuclear missile. The Russians will detect it. They'll launch their nuclear missiles. And there will be a nuclear holocaust, the destruction of the human race. And it's all because you got him that slingshot for Christmas. So don't do that. The way similarity works plays into creating this slippery slope argument, right? Because A is similar to B, and B is similar to C, and C is similar to D, and so on, it doesn't mean that A is similar to the thing on the end of the chain, right? Now, if there were a basis for the chain reaction, this does happen, right? There are cases where there does tend to be a chain reaction. One thing does tend to lead to another. I mean, obviously, if I had dominoes, right? If I had literally dominoes lined up, and the last one, was some catastrophe was going to happen, like the last one was going to fall on a button, which was going to launch a nuclear missile or something, right? Why would that be set up like that? But so if I said, well, if you knock that first domino, right, then the second one followed, then the third one, and then so on, and then the last one falls on the button. You shouldn't say that's just slippery slope argument. That's a fallacy. Well, in this case, of course, there is a reason to expect a chain reaction. Or if I say, I don't think you should try heroin at that party. With your friends were saying try some of this heroin. Bad idea. Tell you why? Because heroin's an addictive substance. You try it once, you may like it. You may choose to try it a second time. 2-3 times in, you could easily get addicted. And, then this affects your life. You start spending all your money on it. You stop paying attention to school, stop going to work. And then somebody's going to say, oh, that's just slippery slope. You're, telling me it's going to lead to this disaster. But just try some heroin. Right? Well, in this case, there's like a known pattern, established pattern where one thing does tend to lead to the other. So yes, there's such a thing as real chain reactions, but very often this type of reasoning gets abused, right? And someone makes the argument, as long as I can point out little similarities between links on a chain, then I get to this, I can argue whatever I want, because you can always come up with this kind of slightly similar case that leads to pretty much whatever you want. So the next fallacy is called the weak analogy. And when you have a weak analogy, first of all, identify that there is an analogy. What we mean by analogy here is not necessarily your SAT format, right? A is to B as C is to D, but like it relates to that, right? So if you're making a comparison between two things, right? Let's say X and Y, and the similarities are not relevant to the conclusion that you're drawing. So there are these similarities, but they're not relevant. Let's take a case. Usually analogies are kind of abstract, but let's take a case that's not. If I say that Al's car is kind of a lot like Bob's car. I mean, they're both blue, and they both have leather seats, and so they're pretty similar cars. Al's car gets about 40 miles to the gallon, so I'm betting Bob's car probably gets about 40 miles to the gallon as well. Right? So based on the similarity of the color, the material of the seats, I'm drawing this conclusion about the gas mileage. Well, those things aren't related. So if they're similar in those ways, doesn't mean they're similar in gas mileage, right? Be a different story if I made a comparison between the engines, right, of the two cars, right? Then might have something going here. Another problem is that if there are dissimilarities that are relevant to the conclusion. So, the case of comparing the two cars. I make the comparison between the two cars based on the color or something, and then one of them is like a Mustang. Al's car is, like a Prius, and then Bob's car is a Mustang, right? And then because the color is the same, right? I'm betting on them having the same similar gas mileage, and I'm overlooking this glaring dissimilarity between the two cases. Now let me give you a case where the analogy is a little bit more sort of abstract. Here's an example taken from the book. Someone says, when a mechanic passes by somebody whose car is broke down, there's no obligation on that mechanic to stop and help the person fix their car or do anything about it. And a doctor's sort of like a mechanic for the body. I mean, something mechanical goes wrong and they go in and fix it. The body's sort of like a machine that they help correct problems with. So the case should be similar when a doctor passes by somebody who's like having a heart attack. There's no obligation on the doctor to stop and help that person or do anything about it, because it's just like when a mechanic passes somebody by who's got a car trouble, right? So the similarities about, they both kind of fix something that's wrong are not relevant to the moral, right, to the moral status of helping, right? And also there's the fact that if the doctor doesn't help, somebody dies, right? Which doesn't happen in the case where the mechanic refuses to help. So you have similarities that aren't relevant to the conclusion in that case, and you also have these dissimilarities that are relevant to the conclusion. And so the analogy is weak. Okay, that concludes our section on fallacies of weak induction.